All right, let's jump right into this full summary study of a seriously dense prophetic presentation from the source channel Blow the Shofar. Just noting right off the bat that a link to their channel is down below in the description box, so definitely check that out. Today we're going to unpack a highly detailed timeline. We're looking at world events, biblical prophecy, and a profound call for spiritual readiness. And I got to tell you, the stakes laid out in this presentation are incredibly high. You know, prophecy is gaining massive traction right now as global tensions keep rising, and this specific study claims to have decoded a timeline pointing to imminent, world-altering events. Now, before we really start to unpack these timelines, remember that prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated, and give a hype and like, please. Seriously, these deep dives require immense dedication and countless hours to assemble. Supporting the research community helps keep these important conversations going. It validates the intense, grueling effort it takes to cross-reference ancient texts with modern astronomical data. It's a huge undertaking.
So our study today covers 5 key areas. Number 1, the August blood moon. Number 2, Jubilees and prophetic timelines. 3, signs in the 5th month. 4, judgment upon the nations. And finally, number 5, faith coupled with obedience.
Let's move right into part 1, the August blood moon, which the source views as a major celestial marker on the horizon.
So the source argues that a partial blood moon occurring around August 27th could potentially align perfectly with the biblical Day of the Lord. The presenter makes a huge point here. This is actually the last blood moon until New Year's Eve of 2029. Think about that. That's a 2.5-year gap without another blood moon, which is absolutely critical to this specific prophetic community. It creates this immense, powerful sense of anticipation. Because of this long drought of celestial signs, the source posits that this specific August 27th date basically absorbs any rounding errors or timeline flexibilities you might have. If this specific window closes without an incident, the presentation suggests the prophetic timeline would literally have to shift significantly into the future. That would fundamentally alter current eschatological models. So the urgency presented here is totally palpable.
Now, why is this so urgent? Well, the presentation anchors this urgency right in Scripture. Quoting directly from the prophet Joel, "The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." According to this study, Scriptures point directly to a full moon, or blood moon, acting as a faithful witness to sudden, dramatic events. The speaker emphasizes that a blood moon physically only happens during a full moon. Plus, if you look at the text, the moon is completely saturated in biblical symbolism. It often represents a bride or a faithful witness reflecting the light of the sun, much like a believer reflects the light of God. It's a beautiful metaphor, right? Therefore, a blood moon isn't just viewed as some random astronomical coincidence here. It is interpreted as a direct, scriptural signboard, a final warning from the heavens, pointing to impending and sudden destruction.
All right, moving to part 2, Jubilees and prophetic timelines. This is where we get into calculating the seasons.
Okay, so the speaker dives into some pretty complex historical math here to build a framework for this specific year. They connect ancient milestones to argue that we have literally just entered the 70th Jubilee cycle. Now, to really grasp this, we have to know what a Jubilee actually is. In ancient biblical law, a Jubilee occurred every 50th year. It was this massive year of liberty. It was a time when debts were completely forgiven, slaves were freed, and ancestral land was returned to its original owners. It's basically the ultimate reset button. The presentation calculates our current position by anchoring dates to massive historical moments. They trace it all the way back to the 1406 BC Jordan River crossing, and later, Jesus declaring the favorable year of the Lord in 29 AD. Following this really intricate math, the source suggests 2024 was a Sabbath year, making 2025 a Jubilee year. So the logic presented implies we're in the exact window for a major prophetic harvest, a literal gathering of believers taking place right after this ultimate Jubilee reset.
But here's the catch. This entire timeline relies on a massive theological shift in how we read the book of Daniel. The source reinterprets Daniel, substituting the traditional translation of the word weeks with jubilees. By doing this, they claim a 490-year countdown began with the 1535 AD rebuilding of Jerusalem. Traditionally, scholars view Daniel's 70 weeks as literal weeks of years, which implies a missing 70th week reserved for the end times. But this presentation argues something entirely different. It says that by removing the vowel pointing, which was actually added by scribes centuries later, the original Hebrew text uses the exact same root word for weeks as it does for a jubilee count. Changing weeks to jubilees drastically alters the entire Christian eschatological timeline. The source claims that when Sultan Suleiman ordered the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls around 1535 AD, it kicked off a 60th Jubilee cycle. And that leads to a 490-year countdown that lands exactly on our present timeline. Talk about a paradigm shift.
Let's shift gears to part 3, signs in the 5th month. The duality of Av. The source really zeroes in on the month of Av as the critical window. Historically, it's a time associated with both the grape harvest and immense historical calamity. The presentation notes an amazing, truly dramatic duality here. On one hand, Av is traditionally a month of intense mourning for Israel due to catastrophic historical judgments. It's literally known as a time of national weeping. But on the other hand, the middle of Av features a joyous, vibrant festival of matchmaking, weddings, and the new wine harvest. The presenter connects this sharp contrast directly to biblical parables of the harvest, suggesting the day of the Lord arrives exactly during this dual season. It's presented as a time that will bring unprecedented weeping for the world, but the joyous, ultimate wedding feast for the prepared bride.
To really illustrate this preparation, the speaker contrasts the biblical parable of the wise and foolish virgins. They associate true wisdom with the timing of the full moon and ongoing, steadfast obedience. Picture the midnight hour from the parable. It's pitch black outside. Then, the cry rings out that the bridegroom is coming. The argument presented is that the full moon divides the night directly at midnight, shining perfectly bright until morning. The wise virgins are those whose lamps do not go out. They possess the oil of enduring light and obedience, perfectly aligning with a full moon calendar. In stark contrast, the presenter claims the foolish virgins are those following a dark or sliver moon calendar. They arrive at the wrong time, totally lacking the oil of obedience, and they find the door of salvation completely and permanently shut.
Now let's transition into Part 4, Judgment upon the Nations, and how it ties into repeating historical patterns.
The historical pattern outlined by the source here is honestly striking. Think about this. The first temple fell in the month of Av, specifically around the 9th or 10th, bringing severe judgment upon ancient Israel. Then, the second temple fell in the exact same month on those exact same days. That represents a repeated, cyclical judgment. It's like history rhyming in the most severe way possible. The speaker references the prophet Ezekiel, who noted a profound prophecy stating Jerusalem would be overturned not once, not twice, but 3 times. The presenter firmly believes this historical pattern of the temples falling in Av is absolutely not a coincidence. Instead, they see it as a precise, divinely orchestrated template pointing toward a third and final overturning. However, this future judgment won't just be localized to the Middle East. It is prophesied to be a massive overturning that will shake the nations globally during this exact same window.
And this brings us to a massive warning. The source asserts that a modern global empire faces sudden destruction by fire, fulfilling these ancient prophecies in a single hour. The presentation points straight to Revelation 14:8, which reads, "Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." In this study, this is interpreted as a spiritual Babylon ruling over the kings of the earth today. We're talking about a massive interwoven global system of economic, political, and cultural dominance. It's the whole shebang. The speaker argues that just as ancient Israel was judged for compromising with foreign nations, a massive judgment is about to fall on this modern empire. The presenter warns that the stakes could literally not be higher. This destruction is said to be startlingly swift, wiping out a significant portion of the earth in what the world will likely perceive as a sudden, catastrophic global conflict.
Finally, we reach Part 5, Faith coupled with obedience, walking the narrow gate.
This is where the presentation shifts gears from mathematical prophecy to a very strict behavioral mandate. The speaker strongly concludes that mere intellectual belief is basically a placebo, and that true salvation requires strict adherence to Torah commands. This includes things like the Sabbath and dietary laws. This is perhaps the most pointed aspect of the presentation, and it represents a radical departure from mainstream modern theology. The source strongly argues against the popular idea of a simple sinner's prayer that guarantees eternal security regardless of your future actions. Instead, the speaker insists that believers must keep the Sabbath as a literal seal of loyalty. They must strictly avoid unclean foods like swine as commanded in Leviticus, confess and forsake sin, and actively strive to enter the narrow gate. The underlying argument here is pretty straightforward. You can't claim to follow the King of the universe if you flat out reject the foundational laws of his kingdom.
To back up this heavy theological stance, the source turns to 1 John chapter 2, verse 4. "He that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him."
Wow.
The presenter stresses that willful ignorance or rejection of biblical commands, like the Sabbath, is spiritually dangerous. The presentation makes it clear that while perfection isn't expected immediately, since everyone is blinded by sin at first, a genuine, agonizing desire to obey, repent, and uphold the law is the absolute standard. Just think about the tremendous weight this places on the believer, according to the source.
It asserts that believing in your mind without obeying in your physical actions is a complete and total deception.
So the presentation leaves us with this incredibly provocative question. Are you truly walking on the highway of holiness or resting on assumptions? It forces a really deep reflection on personal obedience and spiritual readiness. It challenges you to examine the tension between the modern preaching of free grace and the strict, grueling obedience outlined in this study. Are you just resting on an assumption of safety, or are you actively striving to enter the narrow gate before that midnight hour strikes? It's definitely something to chew on.
To end this study, a big thanks for the Gospels Compared members for helping this channel produce fruit.
And also, since we are still here, TGC invites the Rapture Brethren to hit the membership button on this channel, The Gospels Compared.
As a thank you, members who bless TGC receive early access to extra content, and members may request a summary study of their choice.